Thank you very much, Juan. Thank you very much, Charlie. Thanks for this introduction. Delighted to be here with you. Let me take my watch out. I really appreciate being here at the Festival of Media, and especially to talk about this issue about whether Latin America can compete, because over the past 7 years, I've done virtually nothing but traveling around the world to try to answer that question. I've been to China, to India, to Singapore, to Finland, to Sweden, to Israel, to many countries that are excelling in education, science, technology, and all these things that help them grow faster and reduce poverty faster. And then, of course, I went to Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Venezuela, all the countries in Latin America to find out what we are not doing in order to grow as fast as they are. And during those trips, and the result of it was summed up in my last book, during those trips, I interviewed everybody a journalist can aspire to interview. I talked with President Obama, virtually every president in Latin America, Bill Gates, Minister of Education, Minister of Science and Technology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in the few minutes I have here, I want to share with you a few things I learned in these trips. And I want to start by recalling an interview I did in my TV show on CNN in Espanol with Bill Gates. Because I asked Bill Gates to answer this precise question, whether Latin America can compete. And I asked him, okay, you founded Microsoft, you've been all over the world, you talk with all presidents, with all business leaders, you've dealt with that question more than anybody else. And Bill Gates, of course, started talking about China. You know, he's big on China. He said, oh yeah, Latin America can compete, but China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I asked him, okay, so what's missing in Latin America? What should Latin America do to compete at a higher level, as Juan was saying? Because we all know it can compete. The question is at what level it can compete. And he thought it over for a few seconds. And I said, you know, what does Latin America need? And he thought it over for a few seconds and said something that at the start I didn't understand. He said, humbleness. And it took me a few seconds to figure out what he was saying, but when he explained it to me, it made a lot of sense. Because Asian countries are humble. When I went to China and interviewed the Minister of Education and asked him, how come you guys are doing so well in education? China is #1 in student tests. And he didn't tell me, you know, oh, we are doing great for this and that. He told me, you know something, we're not doing great. The Indians are doing much better stuff. Indians are doing much better stuff at the university level, et cetera, et cetera. So I went to India. So I go to India, and I interview the Indian Minister of Education, and he tells me, oh, thank you very much, but you shouldn't have come here. You should have gone to Singapore. They're doing the right thing. So I go to Singapore, and the Minister of Education tells me, you know, yeah, okay, we're doing well, but we're still, you know, lagging behind in this and that. When I go to Latin America, when I interview Latin American ministers of education, they tell me, oh, we're doing great. There's a big difference. The Asians are humble, are paranoid. They're always looking around them and seeing somebody else who's doing things better. We in Latin America think that we got it right. That leads to complacency. We lack humbleness. Now, I see many of you come from Latin America, or my fellow Latin Americans. I know what many of you are thinking. ¿Qué hace un argentino hablando de humildad? What is an Argentine doing talking about humbleness? But that's why I bring Bill Gates, because he's the one who said it. We need constructive paranoia. We need to be paranoid. The Asians are paranoid, we are not. The second thing that I learned in all these travels and I'm going to the macro to the micro, is that we in Latin America are too focused in the past, and the Asians are much more focused on the future. And I learned that when I got to Singapore, and I went to the airport. I mean, at the airport, I tried to change some money to get Singapore money to take a cab and go to the hotel. And the teller, gave me some Singapore dollars, and when I was looking at the Singapore dollars, I was struck by what I saw. What do we have in Latin America in the backside of our bills? Nuestros próceres, our independence heroes. What do the Singaporeans have in the back of their belts? Gareth, can you show me the slide, please? The Singapore $2 bill, which is the smallest denomination bill they have because the rest is coins, they have a teacher, a professor, on the left side, you can see him, students, and at the bottom, one word. What does it say? Education. We are looking to the past, and they are looking to the future. And that's evident in our culture wherever you go. You go to any bookstore in Latin America. Thanks, Gareth. You go to any bookstore in Latin America, and what are the bestsellers? What are the best-selling books? History books, historical novels. In Asia, you go to any bookstore, and the books you see are about the future, about innovation, about science and technology and education. And we're obsessed with the past. Not only our bookstores, our whole countries are focused on the past. The worst case of all is Venezuela, of course. They changed the name of the country to Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela in honor of the independence hero Simón Bolívar. They changed all the letterhead, and the president of Venezuela speaks to the nation in front of a huge image of Simón Bolívar. Now, and in every speech, he justifies Simón Bolívar's what he said and what he didn't say to sort of back up his policies. And everything, is last year. I don't know how many of you follow the Latin American press, but last year, Chavez, the president of Venezuela, came up with this idea that Bolívar did not die of tuberculosis, as most historians say, but that he died, that he was killed, murdered by the oligarchy. So he appointed a presidential commission, spent I don't know how much money, to look into who presumably, apparently killed Bolívar. So the whole country was paralyzed for months with this investigation, and then finally they exhumed the remains of Bolívar. The whole country was, on live TV. They put funeral music. They took the remains of Bolívar. Chavez on TV cried, took a boot out of the coffin. Of course, the joke by the Venezuelan opposition was in that nationally broadcast scene, Chávez no le estaba mostrando a Venezuela los restos de Bolívar, sino que le estaba mostrando a Bolívar los restos de Venezuela. Chávez was not showing Venezuelans the remains of Bolívar, but he was showing Bolívar the remains of Venezuela. But that's a different story. But the same thing happens in most Latin American countries. We are too fixed with the past and too little fixed into the future. It happens in Ecuador, it happens in Central America. In Central America, 2-3 years ago, there was a huge debate about where the remains of Morazán, the Central American independence hero, should be buried. It was crazy. The Salvadoran president went to, the Honduran president went to El Salvador to get some decoration. And during the decoration ceremony, he said, the remains of Morazán should come to my country. And then the whole of Central America for like 3 years started debating where the remains of Morazán should be buried. And that sort of took columnists and TV debates, et cetera, et cetera. And the whole thing was terribly complicated because Morazan, I think, was born in El Salvador, was killed in Costa Rica, and buried in Honduras, or the other way around. It was really complicated. In the end, I think they decided to do some kind of turismo necrológico, to send him like 6 months to every country, something like that. But at any rate, we are spending too much time looking into the past and too little time looking into the future, into the issues of the future, like education, science, technology. And there we have a problem. There we have a big, big problem, because we are way behind in most of these items. I was talking about humbleness earlier. There's a fascinating poll by the Inter-American Development Bank that says that when Latin Americans are asked whether they're satisfied with their public education systems, 80% of Latin Americans say yes. When Latin America ends up last in almost every academic ranking in the world. So let me, before I get to the good news and I don't get you too depressed, let me just cite a couple of data on how badly we're doing on education, science, and technology. First horror story, the PISA tests. Are you familiar with the PISA test? Not really. The PISA test is a test that is done across the world of 15-year-old students. It comes out every 3 years. It's done in about 65 countries from all over the world. And it tests kids on math, science, and reading comprehension. And of the 65 countries, Latin American countries are at the bottom of the list. In the last PISA test, Shanghai in China came in first in the world. The students, the kids in Shanghai, the high school students, did best in the world. The South Korean kids came in second place. Finland came in third place. US kids came in 17th place. And the first Latin American country on that list, Chile, ranked number 44, followed by Mexico and number 48, Colombia number 53, Brazil 58, Argentina 59th, and Peru 63rd. So out of 65 countries, Latin American countries were at the bottom of the list. Second example, there are 3 rankings of the world's best universities. One is done in China, one is done in London, and the third one is done in the US. In none of these rankings do you see a Latin American university among the first 150 best universities in the world. That is terrible. The first Latin American university, the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, in the ranking where it does best, it comes out in the 169th place. That's a scandal. Brazil is the 5th, 6th, 7th economy in the world. It should have a university in the first 10 places, or 20 places, or 30 places, or 50 places, or 100 places. But the first Latin American university ranks number 169th in the world. Scandalous. Third example, when it comes to innovation, to patents, to patent registrations, South Korea, just one small Asian country, last year registered 13,000 patents here in the US Registry of Trademarks and Patents. 13,000. How many do you think that all Latin American countries together registered? Take a pick. 13,000, a little bit less. 500. All 30 plus Latin American countries together registered less than 500 patents in the US, which is the biggest market in the world and the place where you want to register a patent if you want to sell something big time. Brazil registered 230, Mexico 114, Argentina 50. South Korea, 13,000. Now, think of it. 50 years ago, South Korea was much poorer than any Latin American country. It had pretty much the same income per capita as Honduras, a little bit less. Today, South Korea is 2-3 times wealthier on a per capita basis than any Latin American country. 13,000 patents versus 500 of all Latin American countries together. Fourth horror story, and I'm glad they're not students here because they would hate to hear this, but we in Latin America, we have the longest vacations in the world. I'm not kidding. There was a piece by the Associated Press just yesterday. I had it in my book a year ago, but the AP came with a great story yesterday. It was published by the New York Times, or at least I saw it in their website. Ranking of the world's countries with the most paid holidays. Number 1 in the world, Argentina. Number 2, Colombia. Argentina, just 3 weeks ago, approved, the Congress passed a law approving yet a new holiday, which was last week, September, bringing to 19 paid holidays a year. That is in addition to vacations. Colombia is second in the world with 16 paid holidays a year in addition to vacations. By comparison, here in the US, we have 10 paid holidays a day, which is half as Argentina's. And the European countries have even fewer, although they have longer vacations. So the headline today, I just before coming here, I checked this story in several media. Fox had a headline saying, "Need more vacations? Move to Argentina." Fifth horror story, when it comes to school days per year, we in Latin America have the shortest school year in the world almost. Look, in Japan, the school year is 253 days a year. Kids go to school 243 days a year. In South Korea, children go to school 220 days a year. In the US, 200. In most Latin American countries, 180 days a year. And if you count the holidays in, and the puentes, the days they leave, if they have a holiday on a Wednesday, they give out Monday and Tuesday as well. In many countries, we have only 140 days of school a year. That is half or less than half than what they have in Japan. So how can we compete when our kids go to school half the time they go in many Asian countries? And that's just the school days. That doesn't even address the issue of the school days, because those of you who have traveled to Asia probably have heard about the institutes, the private institutes. When I went to Beijing, I went to one of these nighttime institutes, private institutes. There are more than 1,000 private institutes to teach English in Beijing alone. And I went to one of them. I'll make the story really short, but I found it fascinating. I went to one of those at 9 p.m. at night, and the kids were there at 9 p.m. in the school uniforms with which they had woken up at 6:30 in the morning. So these kids are studying 16, 17 hours a day. And what I saw in that place, really, I got goosebumps. I mean, it was really chilling, because I interviewed the headmaster. I asked him to see a class. He took me around the building. The building, by the way, was nothing to write home about. It wasn't like state-of-the-art computers, nothing like that. It looked like any Latin American school would look like. And I asked him, let me pick the class, because I didn't want him to take me to a class where they had all the geniuses, right? So we walked through the corridors, and I said, let's get into this room. So we got into this room. He introduced me. I don't know what he said. He talked in Chinese. All the kids giggled. He must have said, here we have a foreign journalist, something like that. And I sat at one corner of the room, in the first row, and it took me like 5 minutes to realize what I was watching. Para que me cayera el 20, como dicen en México. Para que me cayera el cospel, como dicen en Argentina. What I was watching was a board, a blackboard, a teacher, and students in the first 2 rows, as I said, with the same uniforms they had been wearing since they had gone to school at 6:30, 7 in the morning. And then there were like 10 or 15 empty rows. And then at the end, in the last 2 rows, you had the grandmothers and the grandfathers sleeping or reading magazines, killing time. And what does that tell you? What that tells you is that Asian families invest all their time and all their money in the education of their kids. They have a family culture of education. We in Latin America don't. When I interviewed a kid in the front row, I asked him to describe me a regular day of his. He told me, well, I wake up at 6:30 in the morning. My dad takes me to school. We have school until 3:30. Then we have guided studies until 5:30. Then my grandpa picks me up, takes me here to the private institute, and I say, oh, because you need remedial studies, you're not doing well. And he said, no, on the contrary, I'm doing great in school. But I need to improve my grades so that I can go to a better high school. So my grandfather picks me up. He takes me to the school. He takes me back home at 9 p.m. Then we have dinner with mom and dad, and then we do homework. And it went on forever. They had, piano lessons at midnight. It was like, and I was tired of hearing him. Anyway, Asian kids study 18 hours a day. Our kids in Latin America and here study half that much with luck. Final horror story. In Latin America, most of our kids, and this goes directly to the innovation, science, and technology question, most of our kids, to be exact, 60% of our kids are studying humanities, psychology, sociology, philosophy. Only 16% of Latin American, 1/6, are studying engineering, science, and technology. Exactly the opposite as in Asia. In some countries, it's crazy. Like, I was talking earlier about Argentina. At the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina, right now, you have 29,000 students of psychology and 8,000 students of engineering. What does that tell you? College education is free in Argentina. So they're producing 3 psychologists para curarle el coco a cada ingeniero to take care of every engineer's mental problems. It's insane. So, what are the good news? What drives me to think that behind all these common problems that affect the 2 sides of Latin America, which Juan Señor was referring to, both Brazil and Venezuela, we all suffer from these general trends I just referred to. What are the reasons to be optimistic? Well, there are a couple. First, and I'll go quickly through them. For the first time in memory, or in recent memory at least, there is stability and economic growth in Latin America. I don't need to expand on that. You all know it. Latin America used to be the region of the world of wild political and economic swings, where one government undid whatever the previous government did. And right now, for the first time, Chile was the first one to do this 20 plus years ago. The socialists won elections. They ousted a dictator, a right-wing dictator, and basically didn't change economic policy. Then came Brazil. Lula won the elections. I interviewed him 3 months before the elections. He was a radical. He was against the IMF, et cetera, et cetera. Then suddenly, a month before the election, he signs the Carta ao Povo Brasileiro. I don't know how many of you Brazilians you remember that. A letter to the Brazilian people saying, okay, I will continue economic policies of my predecessor, Fernando Henrique Cardoso. And Brazil did very well. Same in Peru. For the first time, we have changes, government changes without wild economic swings that have a terrible effect on investment and on the country's certainty, image as stable as a stable place to invest in. So we have economic stability, we have continued growth despite the world economic crisis of the past 4 or 5 years. Latin America has been growing at 4% a year, which is good. We have increasing self-reliance of these countries, more diversification. They are no longer that dependent on the US. There's more trade with China, with other countries, and that's good. That's not bad. That's good, and I don't think it'll change no matter whether Obama wins the election or Romney wins the election. I don't think that will change. The US is not focused on Latin America and will not be that focused on Latin America, regardless of who wins. Just briefly, I interviewed Obama 3 times. He's an incredibly smart man. He's incredibly bright. I personally, agree with many of the things he said. But unfortunately, he has no connection with Latin America. When I interviewed him for the first time during the campaign, the 2008 campaign, I had him on my TV show. And I asked him, he was senator at the time, have you ever been to Latin America? And as a brilliant Harvard lawyer, he didn't say no. He said, one of my first priorities when I become president will be to go to Latin America. And then when he was nominated, I interviewed him again, and I asked him, Senator Obama, he was on camera, and I asked him, President Obama, who is the Latin American leader you respect or admire the most? He was frozen like a rabbit in front of a car light. And sort of his hard disk started, looking for an answer, and after a few, después de unos segundos interminables, he said, well, I have a lot of respect for the Chilean leader. At that time, Michelle Bachelet was the president of Chile. And he went on saying, she's a brave lady who suffered torture, etc. And the more he talked, the more obvious it was that he wasn't remembering a name. And then, I'd asked him for the 3. And then I was tempted to say, okay, the second one, but I didn't. Because it was obvious that he couldn't cite the name of one single Latin American president. And the third time I interviewed him when he was already president, of course, he was briefed by somebody, and I sat down, and he started listing all the names of the presidents of Latin America and say, oh, as President Santos told me yesterday, and as President so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. Very smart guy, very right on many policies, he doesn't have a personal history of connection with Latin America. With Romney, it's the same. He made his money with Salvadoran and Honduran investors when he started with Bain Capital, but really, he does not have a personal connection with Latin America. Third third positive trend, and that's the one that will touch us most of us in this room more than any other, and you know it very well. The growth in recent years has created a new middle class in Latin America. There are 73 million people in Latin America who rose from poverty into the middle class over the past 10 years. 73 million people. And those are consumers of Google, of Twitter, of cell phones, of all the things many of us use and want to get more people to use. That middle class is expanding and will continue to expand rapidly in coming years because there's more investment in Latin America. Investors from throughout the world and from within the region are seeing that Europe is not growing, the US is not growing, Latin America is not growing like crazy, it's not growing at Chinese rates, but it is growing at 3-4% a year. And that's much better than the US or Europe, so there's much more investment into Latin America going on. And finally, the last two things. There's an interesting trend going on in Latin America, which is that there's a rearrangement of world economic blocs. There used to be, until last year perhaps, or 2 years ago, the idea that the world was divided into 3 economic blocs. You had NAFTA, the US, Mexico, and Canada. You had the European Union, and you had Asia. But now, last year, there's been a major turnaround in the world composition of economic blocs that few people are paying attention to, but that I think will mark the future of the next decade or two, and perhaps the whole century. And it started when President Obama, at the APEC meeting in October last year, said, the US is a Pacific country. What does that mean? Well, he explained it later. He came up with this proposal to create a Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is an idea that would create the world's largest single economic trade bloc. A bloc that would include, of course, the US, Canada, Mexico, but also Japan, the world's 3rd largest economy, perhaps South Korea, and all Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and all Southeast Asian countries together. Why? Why is the US pushing this new free trade bloc? Of course, to contain China. The US currently is obsessed with China. It's the main thing the US talks about this day. You don't read it in the papers. In the papers, you read Iran, you read Iraq, Afghanistan. But when you go to Washington and talk to policymakers, there's only one issue: China. So the US is creating this new economic bloc, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And half of Latin America is already working privately and not so privately to get into that trade bloc. And this year, a few months ago in July, 4 countries, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico, created something called La Alianza del Pacífico, the Pacific Alliance, which is a free trade bloc of these 4 countries, which is going to insert itself into this bigger bloc of Trans-Pacific Partnership and become part of a bloc with Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and all these Southeast Asian countries. So you have half of Latin America, the Pacific side of Latin America, that will become much, much more important in coming years. And finally, Latin America in general, and Mexico in particular, will benefit from a new phenomenon, which is rising wages in China. We're already seeing a lot of Chinese, US companies and European companies that have manufacturing plants in China move back to Mexico because China has become too expensive for them. There are many studies about this. There's a fascinating study by Boston Consulting that says that salaries in the Chinese Yangtze Delta River rose from 70 cents an hour in 2000 to $2.79 today, and will increase to $6.31 in 2015. So the wage differential between China and Mexico was 240% in 2002. Today, it's shrunk to almost nothing. So, summing up, there are common problems to all of Latin America, education, et cetera, but there are also economic trends, stability trends. There are many reasons to believe that Latin America is fit to compete and will become competitive. To move on to the next step and grow and reduce poverty at Asian rates, we'll have to be a little bit more humble, look a little bit more what the other people are doing, and have a little bit of constructive paranoia, feeling that we are being left behind on issues such as education, science, and technology. We'll have to look a little bit more to the future and a little bit less to the past. And we'll have to be a little bit more realistic about our shortcomings, for instance, in education. It's a little bit like when you have a drinking problem and go to Alcoholics Anonymous, what do they tell you? What's the first thing you have to do? Recognize your problem. Some Latin American countries are beginning to do it. Brazil is beginning to do it. They just announced 100,000 scholarships for graduates to do their PhDs abroad in the next 10 years. So some countries are doing it and are doing it big time. If we do that, and if we take a little bit less vacations, we can do great. Thank you very much.